take on that. I'll just leave you with Philippe and Shumi, who is going to be the host today, and I'll retake at the end to say goodbye to everyone and close the session.
I'm just going to take this here. I won't be too long. I'm just here to introduce our speaker for today. As Adriana said, well, let me just first start by saying thanks for being here. I know it's the middle of the week, in the middle of the term, and we're all maybe feeling a little bit depleted, but it's really nice to see a group of us from across the courses here, and really nice actually that we're part of a public lecture series, or rather a departmental lecture series, so thank you Adriana for putting this together, and all the colleagues who've helped you do that. And again, thank you to you guys for giving up your extracurricular time when you could be at home to be here listening to us instead. So, to welcome tonight's speaker, Dr. Philippe Rode, is Executive Director at LSE Cities. That's the London School of Economic Cities programme. If you don't know what LSE Cities do, I strongly suggest you give them a Google, look for them on, I think, YouTube and SoundCloud. You can find lots and lots of past events that are quite pertinent to the conversations that we have here. So, Dr. Rode is the Executive Director of LSE Cities and an Associate Professor of Education at the School of Public Policy. That might sound like a lot of bureaucratic words, but I think get through them and you'll see that there's a sort of synergy of concern and scale going across things. So we've got cities, public policy. He's co-director of the LSE Executive Master of Sciences in Cities. So again, that's another way of looking at things. He's been leading interdisciplinary programs in urban development and transport, sustainable urbanism and climate change, and city policy and governance at the LSE since 2003, so that's 2 decades, so plenty of experience for you to draw from and ask him about. The focus of Dr. Rode's current research is on governmental systems, integrated policy making, and emergency governance in cities, and on sustainable urban development, transport transitions, and new urban mobility. I could say a lot more. I could mention a bunch of publications and essays and so on that Dr. Rode has been part of. He's also co-founder of the Urban Age program, which again I strongly suggest you look up. But as Adriana was saying, today we're going to be talking about his thoughts, research on the sort of urban scale of development. I'm going to ask that you pay attention to Philippe's talk over the next 30-40 minutes, but please could you make note of anything that you think is unclear, provocative, exciting, interesting. That's your responsibility for the next 30-40 minutes to make note of anything that you want to ask about, or you want to learn more about. So we'll come back to some questions at the end, and I'm also wanting to thank, I'm indebted to first-year students who actually provided me with a set of questions to ask Philip initially, but to those of you in the room, please make note of any further questions. Okay, that's enough from me for now. Philip, take the stage.
Shumi, thank you so much. Really wonderful to be here. Thank you, Adriana, for inviting me. It's a first for me, not only being here at Central St. Martin's, but also talking formally about this subject of maintenance. So as a result, what I'm going to speak about is propositional, as we would say. It's up for discussion. It's not conclusive. I'm not here to offer very concrete insights of how things should be or how they may evolve or even speculate what's going to happen. So very excited to hear that there are some of you that are not only going to take notes, but that have already prepared questions. That adds a bit to the energy. And I also wanted to say it's wonderful to be the first in-person speaker as part of this series. How appropriate when we think about cities. In the end, they are so much still about physical, in-person experiences, and therefore appropriate, I think, even under the maintenance theme to physically come together. So that's the subject I was given. Maintenance, the city, and infrastructure. And for a moment, forget about all this sort of convoluted language around policy and executive education. Let's just approach this in a very clear and direct way. Let's take these words quite literal And up front, I'll also disclose what my pitch is going to be. I'm first going to make the case that the way we have been thinking about global urbanization, to a large extent, is about urban expansion. There's almost a bias towards the expanding characteristics of urban territories, and within that, a strong focus on new infrastructure, the novel, the new, the innovative. And I'm then, in a second part, going to provoke and say, given the contemporary shocks, which we're all too aware of, there could be a good case we can think about, that maintenance is being re-embraced, elevated, and maybe could become a much more prominent way of thinking and practicing in our cities. Now, the way I'm going to do this is in 4 different steps. The first thing is a more traditional overview on urban expansion, what's happening out there. To some extent, also presenting to you the work we have been doing over the last decades with a degree of self-criticality, arguing that this is so much about growth, expansion, and the new, as I just said. Then I'll briefly talk about the contemporary shocks. I keep this relatively brief because otherwise things get too depressing. And I come then back to the maintenance turn, as I call it. The idea that we are re-embracing, opening up, warming up in the context of this macro level development of cities to this idea of maintenance and maintaining, maybe even sustaining. And then I want to leave you with a few ideas. So what or what next? What can we do about all of that? Great, so urban expansion. Usually we talk about the urban age. It's the program which I've been co-running at the LSE for a long time. And the urban age is in some ways a celebration of cities and, of course, the expansion that goes with it. But it's not an uncritical way of celebrating cities. There is a lot of problematic stuff. But the fact behind this, and the reason why also a lot of journalists write about this, films are being made, there's a fascination of these man and women-made landscapes that are emerging. And this billboard in Beijing is wonderfully telling. It's sort of imagining these futures in front of then the cranes that are supposed to reproduce what architects, in many instances, maybe dreamers, have thought about what could happen. And in many instances, these type of landscapes, cityscapes, are actually really being built the way these designers had it in mind. A massive approach to manipulating urban form. But it's not all about the planned and designed and preconceived. A lot of urbanization is informal, sometimes directly next to the formal structures of the city, and they share this idea of having an expansionist, a growing characterization, not least because, of course, in most instances we are talking about rapidly growing populations. Now, the way we can present and visualize this urban age or the growth of cities is multifold. This is one example, bringing it down to a very tangible unit of understanding growth, and this is the growth of cities per hour, the population growth here. These are the numbers, and you immediately recognize an axis from East Asia, the eastern coast of China, all the way to the western coast of Africa, where the majority of urban growth and the growth of individual cities in terms of population growth is happening. By contrast, North America, Europe, and increasingly even Latin America has actually a relatively reduced growth rates, if not even processes of shrinkage. And I'll make another comment about that later on. What's driving this population growth? Well, numerically, a lot of this is about natural growth of these cities. It's actually explaining about 50% of these figures, that just the birth rates are significantly higher than the death rates in these places. Second, the famous rural to urban migration, people leaving rural hinterlands and finding often employment in those areas. And the third growth characteristic is not shown on this map, is where we declare territories that used to be rural, we declare them as urban. It's called in situ urbanization, and that also adds to these global statistics on now a majority urban world. About 55% of the world's global population live in cities. The main driver is economic. So here again you see the axis I referred to before from China to Nigeria, where the big not only population growth, but economic growth is happening. So we must understand urbanization as a process of economic restructuring, of economic growth, but it's not only that. And particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, a lot of urban growth is now related to no longer having opportunities within the non-urban areas. Climate change is doing part of that, and it's often overwhelming these cities, which then don't have the economic fortunes to accommodate and to build the infrastructure for these new residents. Now, I'm coming from the London School of Economics. There are lots of economists. I'm not an economist. I'm an engineer by training. But the reason why economists talk about cities and urbanization is precisely because of this image. They realized some time ago that it's virtually impossible to become rich and wealthy and prosperous, however you want to measure this, without a significant increase in urban population. So at the bottom here, you have the percentage of urban populations, the vertical GDP per capita, that's an income measure, and then you have the time axes of different countries. And they have all sort of followed broadly this path. There's not a single country in the world that has become wealthy without urbanization. Yet there are also other things happening. At the higher end here, when once countries are majority urban, there's a lot of economic growth happening through urban change rather than through urbanization. Take Italy, even Japan, South Korea, the United Kingdom. Why are cities so important for wealth creation? Well, there's a very simple story about agglomeration economics, being closer together, being able to service vast areas, vast hinterlands, where you can specialize and seek employment that very much suits you, and where also, in many instances, in rather finite inner central areas, something quite special is happening. And this is where I'm giving you this overview of London, New York, and Hong Kong, with arguably very high workplace densities, where people in the very core of these cities meet on a daily basis to gossip, to exchange ideas, to be innovative, to do what you do here at Central St. Martin's. Be together, even in a building, but in this case, it's a scale up. It's within a district, to meet in the pub, in the bar, in the restaurants, and of course, in the many different business meetings. And that seems to do a magic trick, something very special, and allows cities to prosper and do something which more dispersed settlements are having difficulties to achieve. Now, in order to build the infrastructures for that concentration and allow for the exchange, an enormous amount of material has to be moved and produced, and increasingly so. This once was referred to as the favorite statistic by Bill Gates. I think it came out sort of roughly 10 years ago. For the United States, throughout the entire 20th century, 4.4 gigatons of cement was used. Now move forward into the 21st century, within a period of 3 years in China, more cement was spent on massively expanding cities and territories. This is a statistic where you almost say, this is impossible. I don't believe it. For those that know China, that have taken, whether it's the high-speed trains, seen the motorways, seen the build-up of skylines, they probably appreciate what's behind it. I'll come to the fact why this is not only something we should celebrate, but something which we should actually be deeply worried about later on. Now, in our own work, and these are just 3 of the key publications, we have embraced this growth question predominantly, and of course came to the discussion at a crucial moment in 2006-07, where we were first talking about a majority urban world. But I would suggest tonight that this is something where, on the one hand, because essentially at some point we'll have peak population in the planet, we'll come to an end of this excessive growth, population growth and expansion paradigm, but also something else is happening. Most countries will eventually be majority urban, and it's no longer this transition from rural into urban context that is going to be the predominant change, but instead the internal manipulation of existing cities. So keep that in mind. That's quite important for my argument later on. Let's come to infrastructure. So that's the second title, or the second sort of subtitle which we used up front. If you step back and think about infrastructure as in water, energy, transport, there are different types as a policymaker how to think about it. And essentially, you can probably identify up to 4 fundamentally different attitudes, ideals about what you want to achieve with this infrastructure. The first one is universal access. For the egalitarians in the room, that's what you would embrace. You would try to achieve as much as possible within your nation, within your territory, your continent, whatever it is, to ensure that people have more or less, regardless where they are, similar access to these infrastructures. The second one relates much more to what cities are about, in particular the neoliberal city. It's connecting competitive space. It's helping to produce these spikes of development and connect them with different types of infrastructures. Then we have a third one, which is probably by now 3 decades old, the ecological modernization argument, where with the new infrastructure we're trying to environmentally transition into a green economy, embrace green growth, and really ensure that we are living in harmony with the planet's needs. And then there's a fourth paradigm, which is maybe sort of less sort of present in most of our worlds, but it's about self-sufficiency. And there are infrastructural communities that are very vested in that idea and are experimenting with also new forms of living off-grid, small-scale alternatives to the networked infrastructure we all in London, for example, depend on. Now again, the one that really drives and has been driving city development in the last 3-4 decades and even earlier is sort of the connecting competitive space. And it does make a big difference between whether you then live in central London in terms of the access you have to infrastructure compared to in other rural parts of this country or indeed somewhere else in the world. And whether you include or you don't include housing as part of an infrastructure asset of your city, it's clear that these infrastructures have huge implications and impacts on how your cities have evolved. This is a quick sort of historic reflection. This is Victorian London and the first wave of horizontal expansion, impossible without the steam train and the railway infrastructure. So the terrace houses, these forms of architecture and urban planning, is essentially entirely codependent on a new means of accessing the core of the city. Zoom forward, turn of the 19th to the 20th century, you had the introduction of electrification with a huge wave of new infrastructures which enabled not just the electric street trams, which you can see here on Broadway in New York City, but the verticalization of our buildings with the invention of the elevator. So again, infrastructure is really playing out as a key form giver, form shaper of our urban environments. And then, of course, the introduction of the highway systems led the explosion of cities. Some people would argue have almost eradicated core characteristics of the city and introduced the urban agglomeration at low densities. Again, an important phenomenon which just confirms how influential these infrastructure systems are in terms of the urban form we are then seeing. And today, in most of our cities, we have almost sort of competing realities of these different infrastructures, either creating the endless city. There's a photograph from the periphery of Mexico City, or indeed the hyper-concentration of Hong Kong. And this happens often in the same city at the same time. These infrastructures which are rolled out in parallel unfold their different type of dynamics. Now there's another reason from a research perspective why this obsession or key focus on expansion is so attractive. It's relatively easy to work with. It's really easy to measure. You can almost see it from space. And that's an example of our own work for 4 Asian city-states, where through satellite imagery we were able to trace back in historic aerial photography the slow or rather rapid expansion of these cities. And behind those logics are, of course, very complicated stories of institutional arrangements, of politics, of all sorts of non-physical dynamics that are playing out, which to some extent, yes, you can analyze, but I think we are only slowly becoming more appreciative of, in urban studies, what does underpin the spatial expansion. And there's one dynamic which I want to highlight right up front. Anyone who has ever worked in politics will know that, and it is that the infrastructure focus is hugely attractive for anyone who wants to be elected. This is Sadiq Khan, our mayor here in London, opening the Elizabeth line. Behind him, you have TfL's director. So very happy moments. This gives you votes. This sort of sticks to maybe promises you may have made. It's very, very hard to gain a similar way of political clout through sort of non-infrastructural and certainly through maintenance projects. And there's no one better who could have made a reference to this than Larry Summers, who was the Treasury Secretary under Obama, who was also a Harvard president and an economist. And I quote, "All of the incentives for all the actors are against maintenance. Nobody ever named a maintenance project. Nobody ever got recognized for a maintenance project. Nobody ever much got blamed for deferring maintenance during the time while they were in office." And that's, of course, something which in so many instances then leads to huge issues and problems which we can observe. These are very recent newspaper clippings from very different contexts. On the left side, if you had been there, Times Square recently completely flooded because the city just entirely neglected one of its most important infrastructure systems, the water system. And in my own home country, you may still think that the German rail system is state of the art. Well, it's not. It has been entirely neglected for 2 decades, and if you travel through Germany by rail, it's a 95% chance you'll be massively delayed. And this will be something which we unfortunately have to live with for at least 10, 15 years. It doesn't pay politically to maintain, and that in itself is a huge problem. And in some ways, it's exactly the same problem we're seeing with our ecological crisis, where at the moment it doesn't pay off politically to maintain the planet's ecosystems. And we are essentially deferring a lot of the responsibilities for future generations to sort this out, both financially and in some instances even beyond finance. So let me now come to these contemporary shocks, which I believe to some degree can alter this obsession about infrastructure and hopefully will also help us to overcome the political opportunity that are so solely associated at the current moment with building new. This was a very happy moment. 2015-16, the world came together. It agreed on the Sustainable Development Goals. It agreed formally and even legally on the Paris Agreement. And pretty much since then we not only have we seen a huge amount of fragmentation, but we have also become acutely aware in relation to the extent we are failing on almost all of those targets, because our metrics are now there. We understand what is happening. A lot of the evidence is building up that these goals were meant to be achieved by 2030, and we are way off track. The good news, besides, again, having an international framework, is also that it highlighted specifically cities as a context within which we need to think about our futures, and alongside also our communities in urban areas. But the shocks came in very quickly afterwards. This is a photo of 2019, the summer of 2019, and it should, of course, be an ice sheet, and these dogs should be walking with relatively dry feet, and in the backdrop you should have snowy mountains. It's in Greenland, and you would now wonder, maybe, what's the story here about urban? Well, it's, of course, a story of global warming, and the story of global warming typically is associated with about 70 to 80% of carbon emissions from urban areas. So we are all of a sudden having incredibly complex global relationships between these type of territories and vast hinterlands beyond the core economic activity, which have very little presence also in the political debates in a city here like London. But there is a very crucial connection. We are being told, again, this is where the data is becoming much better, that because we have been waiting so long with carbon emission reduction and with strategies to embrace a carbon-free future, that we are now having to even more dramatically reduce carbon emissions over the coming years and decades than we ever thought. What this shows you here in black is the actual emission curve, how it has been increasing. And we have known about carbon problems well ahead of the 1980s. In Europe, in many newspapers, this became a prominent theme from the mid-1980s onwards. The sort of first formal agreement, the Kyoto Protocol, was 97, and you can see it may have reduced the curve slightly, but the growth has been excessive. And as a result, and the longer we wait, the steeper the decline that is required, as long as we still are hoping for achieving a planet that is safe to live on. And cities now have a new incentive to get on board, because they are realizing that what I've shown you before with Greenland is actually not that distant. Cities are incredibly vulnerable. They have optimized their infrastructures around coming together and being very sophisticated about the type of interactions. This is New York City after Hurricane Sandy, and you will see that this is not a normal photo because the lights are off except for those buildings which had their own generators. And it was, of course, a major disruption, and it was one of those moments which inaugurated a new way of thinking, not only about reducing carbon emissions, but protecting yourself against the impact of climate change. It's pretty much since 2018-19 that we have started to actually think about the SDGs, its goals, and particularly climate, increasingly not just as grand challenges, but as complex emergencies. And I want to briefly build on work which we are doing with United Cities and local governments, which is essentially the United Nations for local governments around the world, on so-called complex emergencies. The argument here is that we will have to embrace much more political institutions and interventions that can actually address these type of complex emergencies. The good news is cities are actually well equipped around the world of dealing with a whole range of routine emergencies and even the non-routine emergencies like major earthquakes. They have the protocols in their drawers, they know how to deal with it. But when we come here to the right, in particular climate and recently also COVID, this is something which goes far beyond the type of interventions we are comfortable operating with. I leave you here with a whole range of characteristics which these complex emergencies have, which explain why this is so difficult. They are beyond social memory. We can't just build on past experience. Much of the uncertainty makes the political intervention difficult. There are trade-offs between lives and livelihoods. You'll remember that maybe under COVID. The political challenges are loaded because you have vested interests, people who actually actively will fight any intervention. That is very different if you have a house on fire or if you have an earthquake. People will normally support the immediate emergency response. That's not the case here. We have no trigger moment, and often these sort of emergencies, if we accept we are in a climate emergency at the very moment, it feels rather comfortable. We have a nice evening here in London. I had a tea before. You know, it's so abstract. It's so hard to mentally process. All of that works against the politics of intervening in a more radical way. But we are recognizing that there is a crisis point, and this brings me back to the infrastructure, because even besides these emergencies, the infrastructures are no longer delivering. We have the measurements in place. We know, for example, here in Beijing, that the build-up of these motorways, 7 ring roads around the city to accommodate car growth, have primarily produced an enormous amount of what we call externalities, costs to the economy, costs to individuals, up to 15%. That's enormous. That's bigger than COVID in many instances. The impact, these are social costs which cut across the environment, go into health and air pollution, and a whole range of other diseconomies of congestion. And something that is probably closer to the ones of you that are thinking about practicing in architecture, giving shape to buildings, is the following conundrum, that the sheer building of buildings and infrastructures in the future is severely compromised by the amount of carbon they are still requiring to produce. So this was a wonderful analysis by the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, already in 2014, looking into what would happen if the developing world was leveling up to the infrastructure levels, the same amount of infrastructures as we have them in the so-called global north. And that alone, without operating the infrastructure, only building it, would result in 470 gigatons of CO2. That may not mean a lot to you guys, essentially this is 10 to 13 times what the world produces in CO2 per year. And in a nutshell, if you were to build the future as we have done it in the past, this would already ruin any climate sort of commitment we have. We're talking then about 2, if not even 3-degree increase in global temperatures with all the disasters related to it. So a real conundrum. At the moment, we cannot build our way out of that conundrum. We don't have the construction material. And it begs the question, have we reached this point, which since the 70s has been debated under this perspective of the limits of growth? Is it now finally happening, where these growth curves are no longer, we can no longer accommodate it on a finite planet? Economists would tell you we need to decouple, take the growth we want, health, education, better livelihoods, and get rid of sort of resource use and a whole range of other environmental bads. But that sort of decoupling is awfully difficult. And it brings us to maybe a third component of the so-called sustainability approaches. The one which we are practicing a lot is all about efficiency, greater energy efficiency, better lights, LED lights, which so often have led to a rebound effect where we just use more of it, more lighting, more travel, even though it's more efficient. Consistency, the circular economy, helps a lot, clearly, but the real question increasingly will be sufficiency. What is enough? Enough of a house, enough of travel, enough of clothing, enough of a whole range of different goods which we seem to require in our societies. So the future is what already exists. That's maybe a provocation where then directly we can build on it and ask about maintenance. Well, maybe. So this is a map of the global settlement structures summarized where we all live. You recognize particular cities of North America and in Europe. In the case of Sub-Saharan Africa and East Asia, it blends in with enormous population densities. And you could make the case, there are already 10,000 cities on this map, on our planet. That's where the future is, and surely that is true. If you look at the population statistics, that would confirm it. The one thing where I would immediately almost contradict myself is once climate change hits us, it will lead to a massive redistribution of those populations, and therefore, again, a requirement for readjustment and rebuilding. So let me come to the maintenance turn, and let me test this with you, because that's where I guess the debate we're going to have needs to kick in. Maintenance in the city actually kicks in the moment you release a new piece of infrastructure or a new building. Here, relatively well hidden, you can see that literally when these buildings open, you already have the window cleaners out there, or the people that help with maintaining infrastructures. Nigel Thrift beautifully wrote about modern urban dwellers are surrounded by the hum of continuous repair and maintenance. I think that's the first thing we need to accept and appreciate. Beyond that, I would like to test with you whether, based on what I've shown you with these shocks, there are indeed urban maintenance concepts emerging which we need to understand as a more disruptive force to the way we think and practice in cities. There are lots of buzzwords here. I will, in a moment, tease out 3 and go slightly deeper. And you may have heard about many of them. Ordinary city has been sort of used as a framework to think about a concept of the city which doesn't follow the simple growth logic and is much more attached to the daily routines and rhythms of people, particularly in the global south. Nature-based solutions embraces the idea of learning from nature and helping nature to heal processes of disruption where we have often used cities to work against nature. Many other care-based urbanism will be familiar with you, urban acupuncture, and even tactical urbanism. The 3 I want to unpack a bit more is first chrono-urbanism. This may not sound familiar to you, but if I move forward, the 15-minute city may. And essentially the 15-minute city is one key aspect of chrono-urbanization or urbanism, developed by Carlos Moreno out of Paris and became incredibly popular over the last 5 years because the current mayor, Anne Hidalgo of Paris, adopted this idea as part of her election campaign. And it also became popular because it spoke to our experience during COVID. The idea that at a walking or cycling distance, you have greater accessibility to your daily needs is a very compelling one. But it does really involve quite considerable change, but more sort of subtle change within the existing urban infrastructures. And the best example is the reinterpretation of what the street, and this is the local neighborhood level street, actually should do for us in our cities. This also comes from the city of Paris, part of the sort of formal publications of how the 15-minute city may impact on the future street. We're moving away from using it as an infrastructure for movement and replacing it as an infrastructure for place-based activities and joy and engagement. There are other aspects to this. I would certainly consider under the broader umbrella of chrono-urbanism the working with time rather than just with space to program the city. So, and that must be something that is fairly familiar to those of you that work also with performance and other aspects of urbanism. The second way of thinking about this idea of maintenance is about mobility services. Now, I was trained in transport studies and systems, and usually you start with infrastructure systems, which are then being used to roll out services. If we accept that our infrastructures are fairly mature, we can, from the beginning, shift the emphasis on services. And many cities, with their practices over the last decades, have actually done this in a rather intelligent way. What all of these examples have in common, they are, yes, to a degree, reshaping infrastructures, but they're certainly using the existing, and they're making it work better, more efficient, without entirely tearing these systems apart. Two good examples of this type of maintaining your infrastructure rethinking is first the bus rapid transit revolution out of Latin America, first Curitiba, then here Bogota, where on existing motorways you're thinking about these not moving enough people, and you introduce these bus systems, making a huge difference. You move about 3,000 people per hour in direction here. On the 2 lanes for the bus, it's 40,000 people. And that, of course, is transformative. It then allows the city to entirely restructure without changing the fundamental piece of road infrastructure. Another idea is around the digital van service, where you provide mobile units that no longer use bus stops, where you share with other people these vehicles, so you have the efficiency of greater utilization of our streets, and yet at the same time you also have a convenient ride, which is a bit more like a taxi experience. And the last sort of thought I had around maintenance is even one step further about this concept of hybridity or hybrid cities, where on top of our physical layers in cities, we are extending a virtual, a digital layer that entirely alters the way we are engaging with existing physical space. Think of augmented reality, which is around the corner, which can potentially change what we do in our cities to a massive extent. But then again, I was left, as I prepared for tonight, with this idea that isn't urban maintenance ultimately about addressing the social and political relationships in our city? So maintaining how we connect with each other, how politics operates. And this is where I want to leave you now under this heading of what next, and then look forward to engaging in our discussion. So what next? I mean, cities are political space, and I think that needs to be re-emphasized and also celebrated. And we need to appreciate that there are considerable clashes now at the moment, maybe less around climate, but there are very much opposing perspectives on our futures. Those that think about the end of the world, and those that think about the end of the week, or at least claim that they, given their own sort of budgets, would be struggling with some of the introduction of a more radical sort of carbon emission reduction strategy. This kind of tension is hugely problematic, but I would argue that our cities are ultimately spaces where maybe we can be most hopeful of still overcoming this kind of polarization. At the moment, we are not doing this. This is an example of a city I lived in many years, in Berlin, where very recently an election essentially almost visualized the kind of polarization we are currently seeing here. So the voting result, essentially a referendum on the future of the car, where inner city areas voted predominantly the Green Party, embracing the so-called transport transition towards public transport, walking and cycling, surrounded by the conservative votes of people who say, no, I want to continue to drive in the city. And that kind of polarization, once it is spatialized, is very hard to overcome indeed. The 15-minute city has become a controversial theme amongst some circles. It's been sort of framed as a conspiracy theory even. Our conservative government has sort of almost abused it for political purposes. The electric scooters have led to huge debates, so new urban mobility being introduced, there are tensions, and then we all know about the ultra-low emission zone in London. These are all examples where in some ways the maintenance approach becomes political and requests a better maintenance of social and political relations. So in our own work, we are shifting. We're shifting from analyzing space to analyzing politics and policy making. We're trying in the transport space to frame questions around fairness, which seem to be so central in order to get the coming together and the agreement we need for our political decision making. And ultimately, we are sort of re-embracing our commitment to 3 levels of urban decision making. The city parliament, don't take it for granted, needs to be celebrated, nourished, developed, and strengthened. The second is the urban technocracy. This is something the LSE is very familiar with working with, but yes, our civil servants, those professional people working in city governments, need support. They need to have the best technocratic tools at hand to deal with maybe a maintenance turn and certainly with the emergency situations I outlined earlier. Maybe the most important one, I'm delighted that I'm speaking right now from Camden, are citizen assemblies, whether they are climate assemblies or emergency assemblies, as we refer to them. These are really interesting new opportunities of not replicating the mistakes of participation in the past, where all the obvious people show up, where those that have the resources, the knowledge, the funding, and so on, meet at night and voice disproportionately their view on what should happen and what not. By contrast, these assemblies are based on sortition. They have a lottery system attached and try to have a representative group of society join the decision-making process. And initially, they are educated rather than being asked to come up with opinion and solution. And that is fundamentally different. Thank you very much. And for now, I look forward to discussing this.
Questions. Oof, thank you so much, Philip. That was a lot. It was fantastically engaging. I thought that some of it, as you're so experienced in urban scholarship, I thought some of it would go over my head, but actually found myself really engaged. I hope that was true of you too. I was just thanking Philip for a really engaging presentation, and found that I could relate to, I would say, most, if not all, of what was being discussed. I hope that was true for you too. And if that's the case, I hope you have some questions or some points that you might want to raise with Philip. I have plenty, and as discussed, I also have some that have been contributed by first-year students in BA Architecture. So I'm going to start with a few of those, and then at a certain point, I'll ask you to put your hands up and I'll run over with the microphone. Can you hear me any better with this? I'm not sure it's on. Yeah, I was going to say, I'm not sure it's on. Yeah, it's it.
Yeah, I don't know.
I got it. Thank you. Okay, I think that should be on. I'll hold it so that it's going to.
Well, I have this one still, look.
You have that one.
Yeah.
All right, so you did talk about a lot of, a huge scale, a huge spectrum of things. One thing that I wanted to ask you to define, perhaps for some of our students, and of course, taking for granted that none of these are absolute definitions, could you talk to our students about, and me, about what you define as the neoliberal city? It was a term that you used earlier, and I'd just like to have your definition of it. That's okay.
That is very important. So essentially, neoliberalism, the second wave of liberalism as it was already thought about by very early scholar in economics, embracing the free market. The idea that you can essentially get the highest social benefits by allowing the free market to operate as independent as possible from state interference, and that through magic processes, which sometimes were also referred to as the invisible hand, you have a trickle-down effect where everyone in society profits. So the sort of the second wave, the then neoliberal agenda, became particularly strong in scholarship, actually, at the LSE already in the 50s and 60s, but in the political sphere became very prominent with Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher in this country, with a lot of liberalization, privatizing many of the urban services I also alluded to, and essentially giving also many private corporations huge opportunities to maximize their sort of profits, and no longer sort of putting taxes on them as in previous decades, to do a proactive state-led form of redistributing wealth and supporting public services. The easiest way is, of course, if you contrast the idea of the neoliberal city with a city that is more led by a state, by a strong public sector. That's one way of thinking it. I mean, more formally, the opposite is maybe statism, but I hope that makes it a bit clearer.
Yeah, I mean, again, if it doesn't, please feel free to raise your hands and ask at any point. But I think neoliberal is one of those words that gets used quite a lot, a bit like, I don't know, maybe even sustainable or intersectional, and people tend to use it in different ways, and it's often obscure. So thank you so much for clarifying that. There are some specific questions from first year, and I'm trying to choose one of my favorites.
Questions, not students, right?
Questions, yeah. I'm not going to single out students. That would be mean. All right. There are questions about biodiversity, and I note there are a couple of questions about sustainability, biodiversity, what role does this sort of play? And I note in your infrastructural ideas, you mentioned the third one was ecological modernization.
Mm-hmm.
And Philippe already established that this perhaps isn't the most attractive one in terms of investment or in terms of even politicians, although it depends where you are in the world, sounding out ecological modernization as something that's important. It is important, I think, to a large part of our cohort. Do you think you could talk about the ecological or biodiversity or indeed climate change aspects of urban growth, the neoliberal city, and what role these play?
So let me maybe do it in a way that explains a bit better where the current tension is around going green. Because essentially there's a broad political consensus that this needs to happen. And my own colleague at the LSE, Nick Stern, published a report in 2006, The Economics of Climate Change, that made it also incredibly robust from a fiscal and economic perspective, that investing in green infrastructure and rolling out green policy ultimately is a huge economic plus. Now, the debate happens around the efficiency versus the sufficiency argument. And I think at the moment we will have quite a few people that are disillusioned by the idea that we can sort of grow ourselves out of this crisis through green growth or a green economy, more jobs and more green cars and green aviation fuels and all of those things, which, you know, at the surface, they're all great. The problem is that those that would then be associated with the critique, some would use the term post-growth or prosperity. I mean, there are a whole range of different ways of interpreting it. Would argue that it's incredibly naive that you think you can have it all. that you can have a win-win, you know, more prosperity, more flying, more everything, and at the same time, all of a sudden, green. And what it comes down to is ultimately, on the one hand, an argument about what's the bigger physical reality in terms of addressing the crisis versus the political dynamics of it. How do you, we talked about the politicians that are often already struggling even with an ultra-low emission zone. If that's already difficult, how could you even think that a substantive reduction in consumption pattern, the famous, you know, buy only 2 pieces of clothes and fly once every 5 years, is going to be something that's workable? So maybe that's how I would respond to this fundamental question. Ecological modernization is more attached to green growth. I mean, it is in some ways optimistic about, as the term modernization implies, that through technology, investment, and infrastructure growth, we can get out of the crisis.
You sound cynical about that.
Not cynical, but I think a bit disillusioned. I think it needs to be part of the mix for sure. You know, without a massive rollout of wind farms and solar panels, huge infrastructures and massive corridors of electricity, we're not going to see many things happening. And I also think there will have to be data centers at scale. An area where I'm much more skeptical is what we do around mobility, about electrification. At the moment, you will see that the car industry is essentially using the electrification as something that turbocharges driving around in tanks, huge, very heavy vehicles, 2-3 tons, and it essentially eats up all the efficiency gains. So if I had seen a shift here of electric vehicles being associated with something that is maybe half a ton, small, 2-seaters, I would be more optimistic. But we're seeing, unfortunately, a lot of this sort of rebounding, right, where you get great efficiency, but then you have 300, 500, 800 horses in front of your vehicle instead of 50, what actually is good enough.
The equivalent of having like 50 Diet cookies.
That's it.
If such a thing exists.
Yes.
Okay. Going to ask you one more question, then I'm going to turn over to you. So please be ready with any things that you wanted to pursue with Philip. I think that, again, there are loads of things that you've mentioned that I could pick up on. But one thing that you mentioned in your presentation that I wanted to bring up was this notion of the sort of global dynamics of leveling up, as you put it, and the fact that increasing access, modernizing, let's say, bringing certain parts of the world into some of the levels of comfort and indeed consumption that the rest of us enjoy is going to have a cost, right? That, as you said, we can't build our way out of this, and the equation that I was seeing in Philip's presentation is that increasing access to a number of services or facilities in some part of the world is effectively undesirable because it's going to create a lot more pollution, a lot more sorts of things, lots of consequences. Is that what, I mean, that's a pretty bleak statement to make, and what kind of points of intervention can we aim for? Because
yeah, I'm glad you're coming back to this, because the last thing I want to imply is sort of this hugely problematic ideas, you know, we had it, you can't have it, that would be terrible. The statistics explicitly refer to if you use the same type of technology, materials, and so on, and that's, I think, a bit where the trick is. At the moment, if you take the building sector and the construction material sector, you may know much more about this. We're just not there yet. And actually what the implication of this is, rather than a complete stop of doing all sorts of things, is at least a pause, a slowing down in those areas where you have very mature infrastructures in place. And that allows then maybe a prioritization where there is a desperate need for sort of achieving, and these curves in terms of how new infrastructure really improves your livelihood, they are very steep at the beginning and they even out. You know, the wonderful new, as much as I love it, Elizabeth line, you know, it's a marginal improvement. If you built a new sewage system and sanitation system in Accra, it really affects lives. People will be able to live healthier, and yeah, I mean, kids will actually be able to become adults as a result of these infrastructures. So I think that it's obvious morally where the priority is.
I think, again, it may be obvious where the moral priorities. I won't ask you here whether you feel cynical about that or whether you have faith in it happening. I just want to read out the question that came from first year, which I think is exactly what we're talking about. It was, and it's not, I'm not offering it to you as a question, but more as a lament, I think, from the first year student. Shall we continue to pay taxpayers' money to continue to develop Western, already sound cities rather than deviate funds to others and more acute needs? And again, whether or not that's likely is a question that we can debate. But again, in terms of our points of intervention or where we can find agency, perhaps it's something to think about.
Yeah, so it's very helpful to always differentiate between the should, your sort of normative view, and your expectation, what might happen. And if we're sticking to what should happen, again, we have all very maybe different attitudes to it, but I would be aligned what's implied in the question, that we have to have a far greater diversity of approaches to development and to a certain degree overcome the tendencies where there's a lot of, let's say, Western kid being sold to essentially also replicate problems and mistakes of the past. It's then often also beyond, let's say, Northern scholarship and research to even speculate of what is it that then happens instead. But I think the more there are spaces for experimentation, proactively provided, maybe even particularly by donor countries that are supposedly doing good in other parts of the world, the better it must be.
I think I've been having conversations with my students about perhaps this feels like a bit of a leap, but I don't believe it is, the kind of decolonization of processes of knowledge and of valuing systems of knowledge that I think might provide some space for intervention. All right, I've done enough talking. Are there some questions from you that I can run give you a microphone to? Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good evening. I have a question because when we talk about urban studies and maintenance, every situation and every context is extremely specific to a country, to a city, which means that when we speak about Paris, London, Mexico City, every city has extremely specific issues, but the idea of like comparative, urbanism, comparative urban planning, and all of this is emerging or at least growing. And my question is, what can we get from comparing cities? What can we get from, looking at different initiatives? For example, you talked about the buses in Bogota, but it's extremely specific to Bogota, to its political situation, economic situation. But what can we get from learning all of that and comparing all of that?
Great. This links to one of the very intense debates about 10 years ago, where the question in urban studies was indeed whether sort of a unifying global narrative about what this is all about is appropriate or not. And no surprise, you had the economists which said, look, our urban theories are solid, they're around agglomeration and scaling effects. You can explain what is happening in Kinshasa in some ways in the same way you can do it for Bogota or for Birmingham. And the opposing group, so to speak, was coming more from anthropology, sociology, very much structured around the idea of the ordinary city argument, saying like, no, what is happening in sub-Saharan Africa is completely and ultimately a different story. That sort of academic debate has fizzled out, and I think it hasn't properly been settled. I think there is no 100% right or wrong. It confirmed that people operate at very different levels of analysis and thinking, maybe. But you also asked a much more practical question around, all right, what's the purpose of exchanging ideas? And let's take the BRT system, which on the surface you could say is particularly suitable for context of Latin American cities that had the introduction of the North American highways and therefore enough space to do so. Then indeed in the 2000s, some colleagues referred to it as this is almost an idea virus that was then spreading. It was going to Asia, it was then going to sub-Saharan Africa. A lot of cities built them. I think by now more than 300 cities run these BRT systems, so went from Latin America around the world. And in some contexts, it didn't account enough for the context. It didn't really account enough for that the road systems operate differently. I was myself a bit involved in the system in Delhi, which was operating for 5 years and was taken out again.
I was going to say, how did they do that?
Yes, and there were very clear sort of technical mistakes being made. And I think this is where I would push back. I think cities learning from each other around the ultimate common good or maybe public purpose or social value of creating accessibility to each other, to ideas, having access to goods and services, that's the proposition which, whether you are somewhere in Far East Asia, in Europe or Latin America, is very similar. And around that idea, you have a very sort of confined sort of level of answers. And I think by now we have relatively sound science telling us what type of accessibility is more agreeable with our economic, social, and environmental objectives. And questions of density, mixed use, public transport-oriented development is, I would say, fairly universal. Happy to debate it, but I would probably go as far, just for the provocation, saying like this is a universal story in cities.
And there's a lot of people in the room going, is it? But I think that's the point. These things are not like fixed, resolved. But thanks, Philip, for offering where you think it is. I see a hand up there. I'm going to give it to you. Can I have all the hands, actually, that I have at the moment? Okay, so I'll leave it with the gentleman in the black. And if you could pass it to the gentleman in the green behind you after you're done. I don't have to dance around so much. Thank you.
So continuing the theme of learning about past ideas, I just want to bring up the idea that you mentioned about the 15-minute cities. So I found it to be quite similar to the communist idea of the micro-district. Do you think there is any strong similarities, and do you think there is anything, if there are similarities, do you think there is anything to learn from this previous idea?
There are absolutely similarities, and it's interesting that you highlight this, because the political instincts of people in this country on the right go exactly in that direction. You know, they on the right in this country. You know, I mean, the 15-minute city was seen as a communist sort of plot.
I see what you mean.
Yeah, and was framed as sort of the 21st century sort of rediscovery of Stalinistic planning ideas. Why does it why does it maybe alienate people? Well, it rubs, if you interpret it wrongly, it rubs against notions of freedom. You know, where essentially wherever you want to go, do your shopping, go to your school, it's an individual choice. So, and on social media, some of the very nasty interpretations of the 15-minute city was literally to say people will be confined to, they will be deprived of entering territories beyond the 15-minute city. It was complete conspiracy stuff, but that's what happened. In defense of the 15-minute city, and where of course then it becomes different from the centralized planning ideal, it's an offer. It's an offer to local residents to say, we are keen to improve the services within a 15-minute walking radius. Whether you, I mean, we would assume that will be attractive to you, fine, but no one will deprive you from, going further, particularly for your job, and this is quite important. I think this is where some of the 15-minute city thinking is naive. I refer to the big labor market sheds, the specialization. If you stay in London after your studies, the big advantage of this city is you have an access to a labor pool of 20 million people, and your job may not be, in Camden, it may be in Brighton, but it's part of the same broad agglomeration, and that's its big advantage, which, of course, the 15-minute city shouldn't eradicate or take away.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And then if you could pass it to Mama behind you. Fantastic. Thank you.
Hi. I wanted to talk about the...
Right into the mic,
Oh,
Mama.
sorry.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Sorry about that. I wanted to talk about cities and like the expansion of cities and how like they focus mostly on like the efficiency of the city and what kind of interventions can you take to make a city more, to keep a city's cultural identity.
Okay.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Yeah, I think actually that probably goes hand in hand what I was advocating for, a shift with the maintenance shift, a shift away from focusing on economic efficiency in particular and shifting towards something that celebrates communal spaces, the political character of the city, and then also, I mean, I think we haven't said enough about it, the re-embracing of nature as part of our urban systems, which this image speaks a little bit to. I think, you know, the strategies to do so initially are in some ways infrastructural. You need, in order to celebrate culture, to rediscover the political nature, you have to provide for the spaces where this can happen. Habermas would talk about the arena where we meet, where we connect, where we also debate our differences. But equally, if you think of cultural practices, they require their spaces. And sometimes these are spaces that at the moment are seen as competing with economic efficiency, particularly movement. Rapid movement, always faster movement, and getting from A to B. And that's, of course, the tension of the street, which Paris at the moment is discussing and readdressing by saying, hold on, have we maybe overdone the movement function? Do we need to come back to the place function? So for me, all of this is code to rejuvenate the cultural and maybe also the political spaces in our cities.
And that's such an excellent question. It's also reminding me of two things. Studies like A.L. Weizmann's Roundabout Revolutions kind of brings those two aspects together about, you know, cities want to be constantly circulating both money and ideas, but constant circulation has its costs also. And I'm also thinking about the ongoing, one of my questions I had for you was similar to Mama's, about the fact that I've been feeling very lucky to live in a city where tension can be enacted and expressed, and for the time being we have legal permission to do that at certain times. Going to marches every Saturday, as I have for the last few weeks, is very much a demonstration of people trying to enact a social and political identity of the city against, in some ways, against what is sanctioned or what is planned for. No, the streets that we're occupying in our marches are not planned to be occupied by marches. That's why it's a disruptive thing to do. And it's citizens that are showing up and doing that. So I just think it's great that there's a real-life example that we can look at in our experience of this highly neoliberalized city.
It's very interesting when you say these streets weren't meant to be, weren't designed for marches. I mean, I can completely understand why that, from today's perspective, is probably what you would conclude. When a lot of these European cities were built, there were no vehicles. They were often designed for military marches. And they were therefore designed to accommodate huge crowds. That was one of the purposes of the big avenues. But it's not the political,
manner, no?
That's true.
In a very controlled manner.
But all to say that the function of the extreme movement is the modern city as of really the 20th century.
Are there burning questions in the room? We're kind of coming up to time. Okay, well, I'm always going to prioritize questions from students. You guys are sat together. Could you not have discussed?
Hi, I was just wondering about the term industrial intensification. So like there's a lot of areas nowadays that's like light industrial areas in London, and it's currently either being demolished or being turned into mixed-use developments and kind of like having vertical urbanism. So I'm kind of interested on what are the kind of like urban strategies that are mitigated around that, and also how do we have like build up high but also sustain the idea of community?
Okay, so that's two questions. One about industrial intensification and one about vertical cities, right? Can we take the question from the person behind you, and then Philip can see what he can answer?
When you speak of this like green modernization and climate-aware development, it kind of evokes this image of like a skyrise that is green and climate-friendly. But in what part of this conversation would the return to the vernacular be kind of efficient? Because a lot of vernacular architecture is very climate-friendly. So I was wondering what your opinion on that is.
Brilliant, very good question. So on the first, and actually now that you refer sort of to light manufacturing, I guess to a degree this could have been yet another wonderful example of a maintenance turn, but in a slightly different way. And it is about, in this case, about the maintenance of our consumer items and the opposite of the throwaway culture. So where certain type of economies in cities can be brought in and brought back to facilitate the circular economy. So this is the sort of repair and maintenance economy where I think cities, hopefully in the relatively near future, will have many more opportunities with non-polluting, sort of relatively small, maybe boutique-ish type of outfits, helping us to sustain our consumer items over a longer time. Therefore, it is absolutely tragic if cities are not seeing the warning signs of converting these small, light industrial spaces into particular housing, because that's a one-way street. Once you have residents in there, you'll never get them out again. But even if it's offices and other uses, that can be difficult. And I think good urban strategies are usually now quite protective of any forms of manufacturing, particularly those activities that are entirely agreeable with local residencies and living and other urban functions. And cities to look at in that regard, certainly Vienna, Munich, many northern Italian places have that attitude as well now in their sort of zoning or planning codes. The second question was about, remind me.
There was one about industrial intensification, verticality, and then the vernacular.
Okay, so on...
Don't feel obliged, whatever you can.
No, so certainly the vernacular. The vernacular has one problem, and that's of scale. It's beautiful, you know, and you open up architectural magazines, and it's wonderful to celebrate these very particular, very context-specific ideas of intervening. They work well as lighthouses, as reminders of what could be possible. But in order to really bend the curves I have been talking about, they need to be translated to something that is happening at scale. And I guess at that point, even if the intervention is initially small, you would no longer use the terminology of vernacular. And, you know, there's nothing wrong with it. I'm just saying it's important to use then that impetus for something that is facilitating more structural, system-wide change rather than remaining a beautiful exception.
Can we think about vernacular systems thinking instead of like vernacular building with mud? I think potentially, right? Any more from the audience? I've got one more that I might ask you just to round up, because I was somewhat distressed by the quote by, I shouldn't call him Larry, I've got this bad habit of calling people by their first name.
Mr. Summers.
Larry Summers' comment that, maintenance is never celebrated kind of reminds me of scholarship and theory coming from the domestic level, where on a domestic level, the person who maintains the home, often the female within a social group, is not given the status of the breadwinner. The person who actually does the maintenance is not actually recognized as that. So, Philip, can I ask you to cite one or two maintenance projects which can or should be celebrated on an urban scale? I can think of building scale ones. I can think of certain methodologies or techniques of building that I know about in Africa, in Japan, where maintaining the building is something that is a celebratory and recognized cultural, social, and political act. But can you think of anything on an urban scale?
So let's go back to this quote. That came up in the context of the infrastructural crisis in the United States, collapsing bridges and no railways and huge frustrations about that.
The quote was, "Nobody is recognized for maintenance."
Exactly, but it was at a conference discussing that type of infrastructure, so it wasn't a reference. Maybe you would have said the same about domestic work, but leaving that aside, the first thing, there is of course a question of scale and sort of the grandiose notion of these infrastructures imply that with the maintenance idea, do we want to go there? Do we want to have the functional equivalent of, once again, celebrating superstar maintenance, right? And maybe that in itself is problematic. I mean, that would be my immediate thought. Mm-hmm. Maybe maintenance in itself is much more distributed to begin with, and that is good news, right? Rather than, oh my God, now we need to have the goddess of maintenance, and we need to build a statue because most likely she has done such an amazing job to the betterment of society. But still, I think your provocation is important because we need superstars and we need people to look up to. You would probably think that the next generation really deeply caring about the maintenance of our ecological systems are the sort of the superstar maintenance people which we want to celebrate, but that's as far as I could go.
Maybe we'll have an MA caretaking maintenance in spatial practice. All right, I think we're at time. Just about.
Do you have a question, Alex?
I'm going to invite a question from the head of our department. Alex, go ahead.
I don't want to do it now, if it's time. No, but is this on? Yeah. This wasn't going to be my question, but we've just come back from Recife in Brazil, which is the most at-risk city in South America for the climate emergency and the 16th in the world. And there the discussion, Shimi, was all about maintaining the rivers and the river edges as a way of dealing with the impacts of climate mitigation. So maybe that will be one of our flagships. But I wanted to ask you about the citizens' assemblies, because and thank you for the talk. I thought that was really great. And you're so calm. And as an urbanist, I'm facing this sort of dilemma of having always been interested in cities, realizing that maybe cities aren't viable anymore. The whole concept of a city and citizenship is no longer necessarily, always up for grabs and is very destable, particularly if we look at it through an eco-socialist perspective rather than the logic of continued production and neoliberal logics. So for the citizens' assemblies to have traction at scale, for instance, in one of the most, one of the top 20 most at-risk cities, what would that require? Would that require a fundamental rethink of city and citizenship, and how would we do that?
That's a big question.
Yes, exactly.
Thank you.
We need another 2 hours. Look, I certainly don't have the answer. I think this is such an important and fundamental point where one feels we need to have as an objective something which helps us answering the question, but sort of tentatively where I would see sort of pathways. We are experimenting a lot with citizen assemblies all around the world. At the moment, I think the missing link is really how much these often very good, far more radical and quite consensual ideas are then having to be integrated into the political process, or they are just informative. There are a couple of interesting examples out of France where the National Climate Assembly had indeed enough power, so to speak, to inform what ultimately the French national government then implemented. But they implemented 3 ideas or 2 out of many, many more. I think at the city level, there may be an opportunity to, you always have to have this buffer of, this group coming up with wonderful ideas, but then the representative democratic system balancing it against a whole range of other interests that exist. But if you have a progressive mayor, this can really be a tool that gives you this additional small push to work with, and that's another important terminology, social tipping points. This idea that you have maybe up until now only 20, 30% that are really willing to embrace fundamental change, but you can work with them and they can potentially help to get a sort of broader political consensus established. So the working together between formal democracy and then this representative or this new toolkit is maybe the missing link which needs to be perfected more. The experiences within the confined territory of the assemblies is very good. I think the internal logic works, and even the fairly established institutions like the OECD are taking note and are celebrating that as a real form of innovation in democratic practices.
All right. Just a quick note, we've had a lot of conversation with our BA cohorts about professional paths, and certainly politics is open to you. So all of these discussions are kind of really building that space in between the things that we do and the people who make decisions. So I think with that said, thanks again for your attention on this Thursday evening. Thank you, Philip. Thank you, Adriana. Let's draw this evening to a close by a round of applause. Thank you.